You are listening to Preconceived, where we examine the preconceptions that shape how we view the world and the paradigms by which we live our lives. Hey everybody, I'm Zale Mednick, and welcome to this episode of Preconceived. Antarctica is arguably one of the most fascinating and mysterious places on Earth. One of Earth's 7 continents, it's easily the least inhabited, and in many ways, the least known about. To many, including me, the preconception might be that Antarctica is this cold, frozen, desolate place not fit for human living. In fact, when people hear the term Ice Age, they likely think of images of Antarctica. But what exactly do we know about this remote continent? What are the conditions really like? Is this unique landscape as inhospitable as one might expect? And what can we perhaps learn about humankind and the Earth at large from exploring its frontiers? I'm joined today by the authors of Antarctica, A History in 100 Objects, Daniella McCahey and Jean de Pomereu. Daniella is an assistant professor in modern British history at Texas Tech University. Her research broadly covers the history of Antarctica. She's actively involved in public outreach and has consulted internationally for museum exhibits on Antarctic history. Jean is a research fellow at the Scott Polar Research Institute, University of Cambridge. His research spans the history of Antarctic science, exploration, and visual culture. He's participated in many scientific and artistic expeditions to Antarctica. All right, so Daniella McCahey and Jean de Pomereu, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's so lovely to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I'm excited to chat about all things Antarctica today. And it's a really interesting place that a lot of people don't know so much about. And you both, as I read in the introduction in your bios, you both have done a lot of research in this area and have traveled to the area. Daniella, why don't we start with you? What was the impetus for writing this book and just in general for being drawn to Antarctica and researching this mysterious place in many ways?
Well, thank you so much for that question. Our impetus for writing the book, it was kind of a, I guess, funny sort of story, sort of serendipitous. Jean and I were actually hired back in the beginning of 2019 when the Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut were going to have a special major exhibit to commemorate the bicentennial of the discovery of Antarctica. One of the men who is a contestant for possibly being the discoverer is from Stonington, Connecticut, Nathaniel Palmer. And so the exhibit was meant to draw on that sort of local connection, but also be a much bigger global, 200 years of human history in Antarctica. And this exhibit was scheduled to open in November of 2020. And as you can imagine, in the end of March of 2020, it didn't look like that was feasible anymore. And Mystic went ahead and canceled the exhibit. But Jean and I had spent the last over a year thinking about the way Antarctica could be conceptualized using material objects and thinking about Antarctic history, not in a national sense, but in a really kind of international sense, and not in just sort of like the heroic age or just modern science, but in this sort of long history of Antarctica. And so we thought, and I think it was Jean's idea to be like, we should write a book about this. And that was, I guess, the sort of direct impetus. For me, my interest in Antarctica, it started pretty academically. I was interested in how we consider Antarctica as this place for science. And, you don't see it in history textbooks. You see it in science books. And so I wondered, as someone who's interested in the history of science, I thought, it should be a place that we should take a look at that history. But it's not like, as Americans, we don't grow up with the same kind of stories of Scott and Shackleton like they do in the UK. And so I didn't necessarily grow up lionizing Richard Byrd or anything. I think I read Mr. Popper's Penguins. I really developed this interest in Antarctica as I was older.
There's so much to unpack there. I mean, the fact that we're talking about it was discovered 200 years ago is a really bizarre, interesting thing to look into. But you mentioned something there that, Jean, I'm curious your take on, you, because Daniella, you talked about it from your American lens there. Jean, as somebody who's European, how do you feel Antarctica was shaped in your mind when you were younger, as opposed to Daniella, who's kind of saying it wasn't really taught in the same way as it might have been in Europe, or maybe conceptualized?
Yeah. Well, although I'm actually French, but I've spent a lot of my life in the UK. And I studied there, etc. So I would say that my way into Antarctica was quite British in a sense, and this is no sort of small thing to say, in the sense that Britain played a pretty major role in the early exploration of Antarctica, if not the major role, not the only role, but certainly a leading role. And being sort of brought up in that context, and I was really drawn to those stories, which are the stories of heroism. So this is quite classic. These great stories of the discovery of the South Pole, of dying on the return, as Scott did, of being beaten by Amundsen to the Norwegian Amundsen to the South Pole, the great stories of Ernest Shackleton and his ship, the Endurance, which sank and led to one of the sort of great survival stories in the history of exploration. These were my ways in. But having said that, I wasn't so much interested in the heroism as I was interested in the more existential element of these stories. What drew me to them was not so much the sort of the pomp and the Edwardian era of the time and the you know, who was right, who was wrong in making such and such a decision. I was more interested in what it meant to be human in such a remote, distant, and, to use a word that perhaps pops up too much in Antarctic history, otherworldly place. So it was this sort of, you know, what happens when a human gets there in that period of time and encounters these terribly hostile and desolate environments, and what does that say about humanity as a whole? I would say that's what really drew me in.
Before we talk about the human history and kind of some of those stories and some of those existential lessons, which I think are probably the core of what I find most fascinating about Antarctica without knowing much, I want to just talk about the conditions of Antarctica. A lot of people's probably greatest preconception is that Antarctica is just this freezing place, and when they think of it, they think of the Ice Age, snow, nothing there, desolate land, uninhabitable. From a geologic or conditions standpoint, what is Antarctica really like? Maybe that preconception is not a misconception. Maybe that is the reality. But what is that?
Well, maybe I'll start with that, which is really to sort of deconstruct that idea. Antarctica is 1.5 times the size of the United States, twice the size of Australia. It's a very large space and a very large region. It's a continent, and as such, it encompasses. Although ice is kind of the defining factor, that the one type of environment that you could apply to the continent itself is actually quite varied in its climates and in its topography, in its environments more generally. So you've got the maritime environments, you've got places like the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the region that is south of South America, but that stretches the furthest north, which is more temperate, where you get positive temperatures in the summer months. So it's not necessarily that extreme, the Antarctic Peninsula. I sort of compare it actually to the Florida of Antarctica, in the sense that it's about the same size, and it sort of sticks out, and it's kind of it's got its own ecosystem to a certain extent, and it's also the most visited place in Antarctica because it's the most accessible. Now you've got the rest of the coastline of the continent, which in different regions, depending on how far south they are, can be warmer or colder. And then you've got the interior, and the interior is 98% covered by a thick coat of ice, which is called the Antarctic ice sheet, which can reach depths of up to 4.5 to 5,000 meters in depth, but which on the surface of the ice sheet is an open white plain. And that's pretty much a defining characteristic of the large majority of the Antarctic continent. So Antarctica is mostly covered in ice and kind of empty, if you will. But along the coastlines, you get these very different environments, and even inland, in some places, you get the mountains protruding out of the ice, and you've got mountain ranges sort of sticking out of the ice, which offer different sort of conditions. So yes, it's true and it's not true. Ice is the defining factor, but it's more nuanced than that.
Additionally, there are some areas that are free of ice year round, like most notably the McMurdo Dry Valleys don't have ice or snow, just like in general. They're often called like Antarctica oases. Also like the Larsman Hills and Princess Elizabeth Land, the Schirmacher Oasis and Queen Maud Land. There are these areas in Antarctica that oftentimes people will like compare them to like, I don't know, outer space environments or whatever, but like they just don't have any ice or snow year round. And the McMurdo Dry Valleys in particular are some of the most I would say, researched and like documented areas because of the fact that they are so accessible, since they're not covered by ice and snow.
And where are those? Are those more west or east? Are those like how far does it even span in terms
Well,
of
if you consider
horizontal?
that if you consider that Antarctica sits on the South Pole and everything around the South Pole is north, so but to situate the best way to situate it, because you do have west and east and west Antarctica, but it's quite difficult to explain, especially in a podcast without a map at hand. You've got sort of three regions. You've got the regions of Antarctica that are south of South America, south of Africa, and south of Australia and New Zealand, if you will. South of Australia and New Zealand is the Ross Sea, which is a sea that's just off the coast of Antarctica. And the dry valleys are along the coastlines of the Ross Sea, essentially. As the name states, they're dry valleys, which because of complicated climatic conditions do not have very little precipitation and no snowfalls and no snow accumulation. It's useful to situate things vis-a-vis the other continents. That's probably the clearer picture without a map.
And conceptually, that makes most sense to me. So I'll refer to that. In
Okay.
terms of based on that way of looking at it, where are a lot of the scientific hubs or located, or people who are visiting, where is that mostly located? Is that beneath the South America area, the African area, or the Australian area?
Well, I would say that so it depends on what you're asking. Like in terms of tourism, 100% mostly coming from South America. And so most people are visiting along the Antarctic Peninsula. Now, in terms of like, say, during the heroic age, the Ross Sea was considered to be a lot more accessible than like the Weddell Sea and stuff. So you had, a lot of the heroic age, although not most, I guess, a lot of the heroic age expeditions, but the sort of Amundsen, the Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, the Discovery expedition, Terra Nova, those are all sort of in the Ross Sea area. And the American base at McMurdo's in the Ross Sea. I think probably the thing I could say is where most research stations are today are on near the coast. That's I think a very good just general answer.
As
Not that
opposed to
many,
inland.
very few that are inland. Jean, would you think that's a pretty fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, there's basically, depending what you consider inland, but certainly up on the ice sheet, which I described, this thick mass of ice that covers most of the continent, there's only 3 inhabited stations all year round. The South Pole station, that is the station that's at the South Pole itself, which is a US station. You've got a Franco-Italian European station called Concordia. You've got a Japanese station, but that doesn't stay open all the time. It depends on scientific projects. You've also got a Russian station. But there are very few stations inland. As Daniela said, most of them are along the coastlines, and the greatest concentration is along the peninsula, which is south of South America. And to give a percentage rate on tourism, for example, so tourism, the year before COVID, it's estimated that 70,000 shipborne tourists, passengers, went to Antarctica. 70,000 is quite a lot when you consider that the scientific and logistical population of Antarctica in the summer months is about 5,000. So by far the most people who go to Antarctica are shipborne tourists. And 95% of those shipborne tourists go along the peninsula. So tourism, if not more, so tourism to the rest of the continent is in another league. It's much more expensive. It requires planes, and it's just a much more complicated place. The places are much more complicated to get to.
Extending from that theme of those conditions, there's a preconception that it's kind of an uninhabitable spot for humans and that humans can't really live there. Having said that, obviously, you just said there's 5,000 people who do live there, who are, I don't know if it's permanent, but they're doing research there, inhabiting it in addition to the tourists. So in terms of temperatures, in terms of wind, in terms of all that kind of stuff that I'm going to sound naive about, of course, is Antarctica maybe not inland, or I'm curious, both inland and on the peninsulas, is it inhabitable? And the people who are living there, especially doing the science there, are they living in artificial situations that are kind of escaping from the extreme temperatures, or are those extreme temperatures not as extreme as we might think?
Well, there's a couple of things there. So first, to answer the question, about the 5,000 people living there or whatever, there are some parts of Antarctica that are not as extreme as we sort of preconceive or whatever. Like I always hear reports every winter time about like this weekend it was colder in Montana, or it was probably this weekend it was colder in Calgary than it is in Antarctica. And, because there are some parts of Antarctica that are sort of temperate during the summer, right? But I guess the short thing is no one can live in Antarctica without immense logistical support. And the main reason for that is because you can't grow food there. And it's not like people haven't tried over the years. The practice was banned with the Madrid Protocol, but people did try to see if you could grow crops in Antarctica. And it was determined that you could grow some very terrible and sad supplementary crops using Antarctic soils in greenhouses, but you can't grow food there. So you can't live there long term, really. Like in general, the people who've been forced to live there, without having all of this logistical support, like during the heroic age, like the Belgica expedition or the Endurance, who were trapped there, right? They, like, famously, all of the men, in some of the cases, in some of these expeditions, the men did die, or they were in kind of immense danger of that. So just like we have astronauts in outer space living in the space station, that's fine, but they couldn't be there really unless there were people bringing them supplies, right? And that's essentially how it is in Antarctica. People couldn't live there without the immense logistical support that they're getting from their home countries, but that being said, there have been in some of the subantarctic islands some evidence of people successfully or not successfully living there for short periods of time. Duncan Carse, who was a British explorer, he was on the British Graham expedition, and then he did several survey expeditions of the subantarctic island of South Georgia, tried in the 60s to, like, Robinson Crusoe style live in South Georgia, and he had to be rescued after 2 months. And then, of course, in our book, we talk about how in the first, documented discovery of Antarctica is 1820, but in the, I think, 14th century, it's been discovered that there are, like, archaeological evidence that Polynesian settlers, like, actually were exploring, or Polynesian explorers were moving far south. There's an oral history tradition that goes to the 7th century, actually, of Polynesian explorers going far south, possibly as far south as the Ross Sea. And there's archaeological evidence that they spent at least a summer on Enderby Island, which is in the Auckland Islands in the subantarctic as well. But of course, the subantarctic is a lot more temperate than the Antarctic. And even there, it would be different. Like, nobody permanently moved there. Like, there aren't people who went to Enderby Island forever, or whatever.
I would say that there's always a little but, because Danielle is exactly right. You can't live long term in Antarctica without exterior logistics and food brought in. But survival stories such as the one of the Endurance and Ernest Shackleton, it wasn't a question of living, rather it was a question of surviving and getting food. And so what you can do if you're along the coastline in the maritime environment is eat penguins and eat seals, which they did, and they did it for many months and survived off that. But it's not something you'd want to do. Yeah, it doesn't sustain a population, or it doesn't sustain.
And also, I mean, that was a situation too where they got very lucky, because the seals and penguins aren't there year round, right? So it's like you would have to, like, predict that you're going to be there for a really long time and kill a lot of them and stockpile them.
Yeah.
That's a really good caveat, though, because my point that I was about to make before you said that was we have this notion that kind of humans can, I mean, it's a hubristic, I think, notion that we can conquer everything, and that humans we can do anything. And initially I was thinking, based on what Danielle was saying, that no, it's off the table. But what you're saying, granted there was some luck involved, maybe there is a situation where humans would be able to subsist in different unexpected ways. Do you think that's possible, or do you think not really? Because like you said, the seals and the penguins that they were eating, that's not year round. Or do you think that humans would be creative enough to find a way to live there long term without the logistical supports that we were talking about?
Well, what's being done right now is vegetable hydroponics, which it's hydroponics, isn't it, Daniela?
It's hydroponics, yeah.
Yeah, which
I'm nodding, but I don't know what that means. Yeah.
Hydroponics is basically growing vegetables outside of soil within a greenhouse. So you're creating an entirely artificial environment with lighting and water, but no soil to grow vegetables. And this is something that's going to be necessary to go into space, of course. So Antarctica has become a kind of testing ground for that. And it's been, we speak about that in our book as well. We have a hydroponic vegetables as one of our objects. And as long as Antarctic, as Antarctic exploration sort of settled in bases on the continent, people have tried to grow vegetables, but again, not in soil. So it's hydroponic, it's out of soil, and it's developed in the last few decades into something quite major, which is to see just how well that does and how much vegetables you can grow, and whether it's a possible analog for space, whether it's something that a technology that can be used for space exploration.
Although, when they're growing these vegetables, it's very much like a supplement to the diet of what they bring. Like nobody is suggesting that they can survive on the amount of vegetables that they're growing. And I would also argue that these greenhouses with hydroponics, that's the logistical support we're talking about, right? Like, it's not just water that, they have like nutrients and stuff in the water or whatever to make the plants grow. But like, could a person survive like by themselves in Antarctica for a long time? I mean, possibly, but like the endurance expedition, yeah, a lot of famously everyone survived on that ship that sank. But of course, on the other side of the continent, in the Ross Sea Party, which was a support party that was intended to be laying depots to support Ernest Shackleton's crossing party. Of course, the crossing never happened, but this other party that ended up marooned in Antarctica for a long time themselves, and 3 of them died. Only one for nutritional purposes. The other 2 got lost in a storm. But, if thinking about nutrition, there's lots of dangers beyond just nutrition. In the Belgica expedition, a couple of people like lost their minds. People get, I guess in Mawson's expedition, you can die of, like in the Australasian expedition, people that fall into crevasses, the person who got poisoned from eating the dog liver, probably Xavier Mertz. There's all sorts of, I was making it sound really like dark and everything, but like beyond the nutritional aspects, even if you can like live off the penguins and seals that you've been stockpiling because you knew that you're going to have to stay there or whatever, there are other dangers there. It's not like it would be like safe if only you had enough food.
Absolutely. I want to pivot a little bit to, which we've alluded to throughout this talk, the human life in Antarctica and some of the expeditions that have gone there. What struck me most when you were speaking initially and just in some of my research is that 200 years ago is kind of when this all started. And I mean, the world of exploration is going on for a really long time. So it's interesting to hear that you also mentioned that there is evidence of Polynesian history or an expedition. Maybe it wasn't even an expedition, but they ended up there several centuries before the bigger expeditions that we're aware of. Are there any other objects that you talk about in your book that suggests that there was any previous human history other than that Polynesian bit prior to the 200 years that we're about to start talking about?
Well, the earliest artifact physical artifact in our book is a fish hook made out of marine mammal bone, which was collected on Endenby Island from that expedition or whatever it may be that ended up there for a few months. So it's not that the Polynesians settled in Endenby Island, and Endenby Island is just south of New Zealand. It's not that far south, but it's on the way to Antarctica, if you will. And possibly the people who settled for a short term on Endenby Island may have tried going further south and not come back. Who knows? We'll never know, or the chances are.
And there is that oral history tradition, right? But again, there's no documents, and so it becomes tricky.
Yeah. And then in terms of documented journeys down, basically Antarctic exploration in its earliest incarnation was maritime exploration. People were heading south. And one of the reasons they were heading further and further south is that the idea of a southern continent actually was born in the European imagination in Greece in about 3 centuries BC, with the idea that a southern continent must exist to counterbalance the known lands of the north. So because the Greeks believed and drew a lot of attention to the idea of symmetry, they figured that if there was land in the northern hemisphere, there must be some large piece of land in the southern hemisphere. And that this might have been a continuation of Africa in some cartographies. I won't go into too much detail here. So there was this idea that something must exist down there. And so maritime exploration started and obviously discovered the Americas, etc., and went further and further south. And I guess the most notable and most famous of these early expeditions, which was Captain Cook's second circumnavigation, led him in 1772, 1773 to twice go south of what's called the Antarctic Circle, which is south of the Antarctic Circle. You get at least one day a year where the sun doesn't set or where the sun doesn't rise in winter or doesn't set in summer. So the object we have in our book to represent Cook is a chronometer, which is a clock for all intents and purposes, but it's early technology of clocks that could be taken down that could be taken to sea and keep a stable keeping of time at sea, and which was obviously indispensable for navigating and for calculating where you were. And so Cook headed south. He was the first to go south of the Antarctic Circle, and he came upon large tabular bergs, which are large icebergs, which indicated that there indeed must be land further south. So he never went far enough south to discover the continent, but he witnessed and the two ships came across icebergs, and icebergs are not like sea ice. The icebergs are ice that has been pulled off the land. You cannot get an iceberg from frozen sea. An iceberg is fresh water from a glacier which is poured out and which has poured out its ice over into the ocean. So for icebergs to exist, there must be land. And so he famously wrote that there must be land down there, but that he certainly doesn't, that he's not going any further south because it's too treacherous, and that he certainly doesn't envy anyone who will go further south after him, for all there's a famous quote, but they will essentially discover only a doomed and godforsaken place from which no one will draw any riches or anything of value, basically.
Yeah, I can give you the quotation. If this imperfect account of the formation of these extraordinary floating islands of ice, which is written wholly from my own observations, does not convey some useful hints to an abler pen, it will, however, convey some idea of the lands where they are formed. Lands doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspects I have not the words to describe. Such are the lands we have discovered. He discovered some subantarctic islands. What then may we expect to those which lie still further to the south?
Sounds fun. So what's the next big couple of, I mean, we won't go through all of them, but what are the next big couple of expeditions in this heroic age that you speak of that then ensued, not right after James Cook, but in the following couple centuries?
We want to probably start with before the heroic age. I'll let Jean talk about the heroic age with his British education. In the 19th
the heroic
century,
age, the heroic age, just to be clear, is really the last decade of the 19th and first 2 decades of the 20th century. So prior to that, it's more the maritime exploration period and sealing, which Daniela will explain that.
In what we have is sealers looking for resources, moving further and further south. And, as I said, Cook didn't actually discover the Antarctic continent, but people are starting to move further and further south in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. In 1820 are 3 different documented sightings, we think, of the Antarctic continent. And so depending on who you ask, there are 3 different discoverers of Antarctica. The first was the Russian Imperial Navy. There was an expedition to the Southern Ocean, and that was meant to be a very scientific expedition, like in the same way that, a Cook's expedition had been. Like, this was like, let's go and try and find new lands on behalf of the Russian Empire. And Fabian von Bellinghausen recorded, I guess it was end of January, early February, end of January, like this land that we now say is Antarctica. Now there's question about well, did he know it was Antarctica? And if he didn't know, did he know he was looking at a continent? And if he didn't know, does that count? That kind of thing. But then a month later, following the, news that a sealer had reached some islands that had previously been undiscovered, the British naval officer, Irish Edward Bransfield, sailed down and also had allegedly discovered the Antarctic Peninsula. And then in November, the American sealer, Nathaniel Palmer, aboard his ship, which was called Hero, discovered Palmer Land, the Antarctic continent as well. So With these three discoveries in 1820, mostly people leave Antarctica alone except for the sealers. The first seal in particular was hunted almost to extinction on the Antarctic Peninsula and the surrounding islands within 15 years. And you also had visits from some like Yankee whaling ships, but not like a ton of whaling until the beginning of the 20th century. The major expeditions you see in Antarctica then come in the late 1830s, early 1840s, as part of, during the context of what we call the Magnetic Crusade. We have American, French, and British expeditions that are trying to discover new lands, going there for scientific reasons, but specifically they want to be the first to the southern magnetic pole. And of course, the British were the first to the northern magnetic pole. And so we have the expeditions of Charles Wilkes, the American, the U.S. exploring expedition, Dumont d'Urville aboard the Astrolabe, who was there on behalf of the French Empire, and the Ross expedition, which, famously the Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, they're looking for the South Magnetic Pole. These were not accidents that they all happened at the same time, right? Because these are all empires that are trying to be first, or demonstrate their sort of greatness. In fact, I think it's Dumont d'Urville's expedition and Wilkes' expedition, they actually see each other when they're down there. They're trying to do these great things on behalf of their country. But again, after that, Antarctica is basically left alone until we get into the end of the 19th century, into like getting into the heroic age, which I'll let Jean, if you have any comments about the 19th century that I missed.
No, so what I would say is that these three expeditions that Danielle has just mentioned, the French, the British, and the American in the late 1830s, all these, as Danielle said, that they're trying to get down to the South Magnetic Pole, except the South Magnetic Pole, which is a moving target. The magnetic pole is a pole that actually moves with time. At that time was situated inland in Antarctica. So these were not expeditions that were equipped for going inland. So what they don't find the South Magnetic Pole, but they do map portions of the coastline because they're stopped by the coastline. So they're sailing south towards the magnetic pole. They can more or less tell in what direction it is through their readings, but they hit a coastline, which is of course the coastline of Antarctica. So unable to go any further south, instead they map out portions of the Antarctic coastline. So it's at that time that in a way Antarctica is starting to be drawn in exact terms. The coastline of Antarctica is starting to be drawn in exact terms.
So that's a really good summary of some of the history that I didn't realize, with different motivations for going down there. One was kind of the sealers, then there was this kind of like space race sort of to Antarctica. And then I imagine, Jean, is when the next phase is the hero stage, which is a different.
Yeah, and which is so the next phase is what is officially called the heroic age. So there's a sort of hiatus for a big chunk of the 19th century. Then it sort of all kickstarts again in the very late 19th century with a number of British and Belgian expeditions in the first instance, and then Norwegian. And anyway, it's a complicated history. There's many expeditions, but if it can be summed up in one way, is that the next stage is indeed to go inland. So the coastline is becoming more clearly mapped. The whole coastline hasn't been mapped, but good enough portions of it have been mapped to start understanding that there really is a land. Well, there is a landmass, we know that, but that it's actually very big, that it's starting to look like a continent, not just an archipelago. And so that there is this big inland, and that inland is the South Magnetic Pole, which we've just spoken about, and also just the South Geographic Pole, which is, of course, the opposite of the North Geographic Pole. These are fixed points around which the Earth spins, which is different than the magnetic pole. So the next impetus, the next drive is indeed to go inland, and that's a whole different venture. That is in a way, the space age, again, the space age of the time, because it requires getting on a ship, going to a coastline, choosing a location along the coastline to building a hut, wintering in the hut, and then the next summer setting off with skis, ponies, dogs, all sorts of different ways which were used to try and reach inland and reach these two different poles and explore the interior of Antarctica. And so it steps into journeys which are no longer just shipborne journeys, but actually land journeys into the unknown. And that's why they've often been called, in a way, like moon journeys. And it's really stepping into the unknown, but it's actually more extreme in the sense that there's no communication with the outside. There's no radio. That these ships set off from New Zealand, Australia, wherever, and you next hear about them, a year later or more. But the hero cage is about the physical hardship and labor of reaching places inland.
And is the motivation for going down there to explore and to find these couple spots you're talking about? Or is it also mixed, that there's this motivation to, let's go on this journey to test ourselves. Let's have this adventure and see if we can withstand these elements in this unknown place?
I think that's a very
that's a really good question, because
I just say one thing. I think it's just, that's a very modern notion, the idea of testing your limits. I think that the conflict at the time, the rub was really between reaching, for example, reaching the magnetic pole was an important thing for science. Reaching the South Pole was not important for science. We knew where it was on the map already. That was more of a nationalistic, it was done for precedence and national interest, to say, I'm planting a flag, I was first there. So the rub is not so much between the sort of wanting to test oneself and doing something useful. The rub is between doing something useful, quote unquote, science, and trying to do something for purely nationalistic reasons, which is, anyway, Daniela.
But I would argue that there's more than just those two things too, right? Like there was, an argument that some made about, well, what kind of resources can we find that are there? We know that the whales, especially after 1906, we know that the whale population is very valuable, but like, what other sort of resources can we possibly find here? And as far as this, like, testing oneself, I agree that to a certain extent is a modern notion, but this kind of like wanting to literally put your name on a map is a much older one. And so you do see a lot of these guys who, it's not like they're trying to prove something to themselves, which I would argue some of the kind of like people today who are trying, like skiing across Antarctica, are trying to like, test their limits or whatever. But these guys, they wanted to, even in the heroic age, it's called heroic age in part because it's like they want to do things that other people haven't done before. And
there's still an element of glory there.
Right, exactly. Yes. They want to achieve that glory. There's a reason they want to be first to things. It's for their nations, it's for their empires. I mean, it's the expeditions that go down there in this period are, Norway, France, I guess Sweden, Germany, Japan, these are all powerful, the British Empire most famously, right? These are all sort of powerful empires for the most part, right? And they want to, do this on behalf of to show the greatness of where they're from, but they're also doing it for themselves to a certain extent, of like wanting to achieve that sort of glory as well. So like many of the explorers didn't necessarily care about science. They might have paid sort of like it might be an excuse to go somewhere, but not necessarily something that they personally were that interested in.
It gets into questions of human nature. And Jean, when you just said that there, that it was not, that it's a more recent phenomenon, this notion of testing yourself and really pushing yourself to the limits, I guess, like people who climb Everest, for example, or these really extreme expeditions. And that's a really interesting notion, because in many ways, one would think, well, human nature hasn't really changed over the last several centuries because we're all human. Having said that, there's no question there are trends in humanity that will shape some of our motivations. So I find that interesting, the way you phrase that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting conversation. By the way, these sorts of conversations were had with every object in the writing of this book. Sure. So it was a great
we fought a lot about like, well, is he more of a scientist or more of a like glory seeker,
but I think that's to me what is so, I mean, you talked beforehand, and sorry I'm interrupting you, Jean, you talked beforehand about existentially some of the questions that are most fascinating about Antarctica and about humanity, and I think that's what this is getting to in some ways.
I mean, I guess there is this mixture of as Daniel explained, of at the time wanting to be the first to plant a flag somewhere, which was just a which was a personal victory, but it was also a national imprint. And getting to the top of Everest was as much about the climber Hillary and Tenzing, or as it was about the British Empire, being the first leading that expedition. Today, of course, going to the South Pole, walking to the South Pole from the coastline has been done literally hundreds of times, and people are still doing it. So that's different. It's not to be the first anymore, although some people will try to, one of the things in modern adventurism is to try and find a route that no one's done before. So doing it slightly different. But on the whole, it's kind of been done. But people are still doing it, and people are still doing it. It's anyone's guess, my guess. And it's not just a guess in speaking to people who have done this sort of things, it's there's an element of transcendence and purification, I would say. I mean, you're getting more in touch with metaphysics here, which is like the transcendence of the body, the suffering and just knowing that you can push through and testing your own limits. There's something quite in my mind, and it interests me profoundly. There is something about, although I'm not one of the people who would venture into such adventures, but about some kind of modern day purification and transcendence of Antarctica, like high altitude mountains, being an ideal place for that, for example.
But all of those guys going to Antarctica, and maybe they're seeking glory, maybe they're there for national reasons, they're interested in resources, they're interested in telling a story to their grandchildren, they're interested in, the science, whatever. I think it's really difficult to parse those things, because people obviously in general you can't really say like, oh, well, he was more about this than that or whatever, to a certain extent, because people are people, and even people in the past, and they have conflicting and multiple motivations for doing anything. So you can't just be like maybe for one person it was more about science than, like, I would argue somebody like Douglas Mawson was more interested in science than some of the other early explorers were. But that doesn't mean he wasn't also driven by sort of like, feelings about the British Empire and, discovering natural sources or whatever, right?
I think everything's kind of been said. I agree with Danielle as well. Although I just want to quote one book, which I've just been reading actually, which is by a Norwegian explorer called Erling Kagge, Kagge. And his book is called Silence in the Age of Noise. And he's one of these guys who's crossed Antarctica. And for him, he's very clear on that, and he's done it. He did it alone as well. That this crossing was to get away from it all, to get away from the cacophony of the world, and to encounter silence. And so that's where you get into this sort of metaphysical, but I agree, and especially looking back in history, it was much more of a mix of as Daniela explained, science, precedents, and all of these things.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about doing this podcast, is that it lives in the gray, and I think life lives in the gray. I don't think it, for most situations, there is no black and white reason. I went down for this purely exploratory reason. There was obviously glory involved, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There was obviously testing yourself, even when they might not have known they were testing themselves. And I remember reading a book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Race to the Pole by James Cracknell and Ben Fogel. I've read it many years ago, like probably about 15 years ago now. And it was about this race to the pole, this race. And I know there's many of them that happen on Antarctica. And I remember it inspired me. Not that I was going to do it, but it was talking about this race across Antarctica. And I think it's something that a lot of people can connect to, whether you are one of those people who pushes yourself in those extreme limits, whether you just imagine them, or whether it inspires you to push yourself to limits within the confines of your regular life.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask you is just, what are some of the biggest, most exciting scientific discoveries or scientific research going on right now in Antarctica?
In terms of past research of discoveries that are really interesting in Antarctica, I would say probably the most famous one is the discovery of the ozone hole that was done mostly by research conducted at the stations at Halley Bay and I think the Argentine Island Station for the British Antarctic Survey. And, that discovery ended up being, which is that there was lower concentrations of atmospheric ozone in certain areas in the southern hemisphere, ended up being really important for, changing laws. Not long after that discovery, we have the signing of Montreal Protocol to get rid of the use of CFCs to try and heal the ozone. So I think that is a really important discovery that came out of Antarctica. Another one that I think is really important is in the beginning of the 20th century, conversations about continental drift theory. So what a lot of people don't realize is our perception of like, the idea that the continents moved and that the Earth didn't always look the way it does now is a relatively new one. Continental drift theory wasn't widely accepted until the 1960s, and plate tectonics slightly after, which kind of emerges out of continental drift theory. But in terms of research being done now, I'm going to hand that over to Jean.
Well, thanks. I would say that research now is split into, and of course they're interconnected. It's split into 4 major topics. You've got oceans, you've got ice and geology, and you've got atmosphere. And then the 4th is actually astrophysics. And I'll unpack these a bit quickly, but there's ocean science. Antarctica is a continent surrounded by an ocean since the breakup of the supercontinent of Gondwana broke up and Antarctica drifted south. So Antarctica is a continent surrounded by an ocean. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents. That's the big difference. So this ocean is a major source of study for its biology, for its biota, for the ocean currents that derive off it and that drive the entire the Earth's hydrohaline circulation, and that is a key component of the circulation of oceanic waters around the Earth. So that's a major field of study, and that's mainly shipborne, although it's also done off stations scattered around the continent. Then you've got ice, and of course, what I mean by ice is, when I say ice, I mean land ice that sits on top of the continent. That is the super glaciers. So if you've got to remember that Antarctica, this thick coat of ice that covers 98% of Antarctica, actually represents 90% of the land ice on Earth, of the freshwater land ice on Earth. So it's a vast amount of ice. And of course, one of the things we hear about all the time within the context of climate change is that this is starting to break up around the edges and melt. And as it does so, it goes into the ocean as icebergs. The icebergs melt and they make sea level rise. And of course, this is a global phenomenon. So understanding the dynamics of the ice and how the ice is responding to changes in atmospheric warming and how it's affecting the flow of ice is key to understanding ice mass balance, that is to say the intake of water and the rejection of ice, which basically enables you to predict future sea level rise within the context of climate change. Atmosphere, of course, it's a great place for monitoring the changes in the atmosphere, and for things like CO2 concentration and greenhouse gases like methane and CO2. And it's because it's so far away from sources of industrialization, and it's a place where the air is very mixed. So it's a good place to read global trends, and of course meteorology. And then the more surprising thing which I brought up is astrophysics. And it turns out that Antarctica is being, in the last few decades, really understood as a privileged place for observing the cosmos through the deployment of telescopes and of strange things like the ice cube neutrino detector, which is at the South Pole, which is a sort of vast instrument embedded in the ice beneath the surface, and which allows the detection of a particle called a neutrino, which provides some information about the Big Bang, about supernovas, about all kinds of cosmic happenings. So it's a place, it's a lot of good science is being done there.
Well, and then connected to both astrophysics and I guess geology is the Antarctic ice sheets have been, since the, I guess, late 60s, early 70s, seen as a really particularly important place for the discovery of meteorites, because, they show up black against the sort of like blue ice surface, and they're quite easy. They're easier to detect there. And now, like, a very large percentage of the meteorites that we study come from Antarctica, which is, I think, very interesting. So.
Wow, the breadth of research being done is incredible. And Danielle and Jean, a lot of what you've spoken about in terms of that research is kind of understanding the world, understanding the atmosphere, understanding ice. Are there any things that have come out of it where they've said this is also a unique place to maybe test out some things that can combat climate change?
Well, yes, and there is currently a number of groups thinking about what's called targeted geoengineering. So there's 2 types of geoengineering. There's the sort of global geoengineering, which would mean some of examples of which would need to dissipate sulfur particles in the high atmosphere to reflect more sunlight out of the atmosphere and thereby artificially cool the Earth. There are, however, what's called targeted geoengineering ideas that are starting to be floated, which wouldn't affect the whole world, but which would find solutions for preventing the ice of the ice sheet pouring out into the ocean at quite such a rapid speed as it's starting to happen. So basically, the Antarctica is within that wider debate of, do we need to geoengineer the Earth to keep civilization going, or does civilization need to change radically and not rely on such devices? So Antarctica is at the heart of that debate. Of course, the answer, you said you like gray, is probably somewhere in the gray zone in the middle, and we'll see what happens. But yes, I would say that. And I'd say back to our book, like we have a meteorite in our book, one of the first meteorites that was discovered in Antarctica by a Japanese expedition back in the 60s, and we do try and retell that and give windows into all of these different facets of Antarctic science and its relevance to the world today through both scientific objects and vernacular objects, etc. Anyway, I interrupted you.
Oh, just that, in terms of Antarctic environments as being unique for studying solutions to climate change, of course, sometimes I'll hear the people talking about how we'll need to settle Mars or colonize Mars or the moon to get away from all of this. And actually, that's where Antarctica is very regularly deployed, because Antarctica, I would say more than most other Earth environments, is treated as an analog for space. I would argue if it's debatable if it's the closest people will always say it's the closest analog to space on Earth. And I would argue that's an interesting question, but that it is very common for things that are, like testing out a lunar habitat, in Antarctica, testing out robots that are going to be used to explore other planets in Antarctica. That's very much a thing.
Cool. Well, Jean and Danielle, thank you so much. Do you have any final comments you want to leave to the listeners here about I guess why they should care about Antarctica, or something meaningful to you about all the work you've done, whether it's existential, whether it's historical, anything? You've touched on so much already.
I can start. Mine is quite possibly existential, but also historical, which is that I started off by saying this. When we think about Antarctica, we think about the heroes, we think about Scott or Shackleton, or we think about, the charismatic megafauna, glaciers and ice sheets and stuff. But when we think about Antarctica, really, we should think about humans, right? Because history is made by humans. So Antarctic history is human history, and everything that's going on anywhere in the world. So that's imperial jockeying, that's the Cold War, that's, gender relations, any of that is also going to have reverberations in Antarctica. So I would say that, we should start considering Antarctica when we're thinking about history of the world generally.
Those are very wise words. Jean, do you have anything you want to add?
Yes, well, I mean, you can see we've been working together for a while, because mine sort of feeds off that and reflects that same idea in a slightly different way, which is that Antarctica has often been called otherworldly. I floated that word earlier. It's a continent apart. There is no indigenous culture or civilization there. It was only discovered recently, 200 years ago. So it's this place that's kind of detached. It's been outside of global history, of human history, for most of its existence. And yet we're discovering through human history, through science and climate, that it is intricately interconnected with the rest of the Earth system. So it's both other, different, separate, and absolutely central and interconnected with our destiny. I mean, it sounds like a big word, but it's true. What happens in the rest of the world, as to repeat a bit what Daniel said, directly impacts on Antarctica, and that impact is then reflected back upon us. So in a way, it's a mirror, and it's central to our human history and to the global history.
Well, I think you've both provided tremendous insight. Where can people learn more about your incredible book, Antarctica, A History in 100?
Well, our book, Antarctica, A History in 100 Objects, was released in the United States and the UK in October, and it's available online at online retailers. But also, if you ask about it in your local bookshop, it's also available, or via Bloomsbury Publishers website.
It's coming out in Australia, New Zealand in beginning of 2023.
I will put links to that in the episode notes, and I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to chat with you both about such an interesting topic that you so articulately and philosophically delved into. So Jean de Pomereu and Daniella McCahey, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Preconceived. Have a great day.